Hi, and thanks for joining me for Chapter 16 of The Housekeeper's Diary. This is a very weighty, very juicy chapter. So I'm only going to do one chapter in this video and it will more than fill the time. We're building up to a bit of a crescendo in this book. So let's crack on. This is titled The Row About the Mercedes, Chapter 16. And it kicks off with the phone ringing in the butler pantry. I always think whenever I hear of a phone ringing in the butler's pantry in the dead of the night, I always think of those old black and white murder mysteries where the phone would ring and no one would answer, and then the camera would pan down and you would see just a leg sticking out on the floor of the dead body. That's just my rather sick imagination. It's not what's in Wendy Berry's book. So let's get on with what she's got to say. The phone rang in the pantry. It was Diana asking for a dinner tray for two. William and I will eat upstairs, please, and Harry will have his tea in the nursery, she explained. We're all tired, and William can go up to bed after he's eaten with me. Now, this is really interesting and quite significant because as you will see throughout this chapter that this happens quite often. And I'm just going to tell you about a little sort of consequence of this that Wendy Berry points out in the first few pages of this chapter. Charles had been actually working in the garden and he'd already greeted the boys and spent a lot of the day with them. And William was quite troubled because he knew he had to go back to boarding school, Ludgrove, after this weekend. Harry was still at day school and William was a bit nervous about going back to boarding school and he really didn't want to go. So Charles had spent a bit of time with him that day, sort of trying to jolly him along and show him support and make him giggle about it all. So he'd done a lot of, good, and Diana had as well. She'd also given him a lot of affection and a lot of quiet encouragement throughout the day. Now, when Charles finished gardening, he came into the house. Charles walked in from outside and padded through to the kitchen where he explained that he and Diana and William would have dinner downstairs in the sitting room that evening. Paul, that's Paul Burrell, had to tell him that Diana had ordered a bed tray for her and William in her room, something from which he had evidently not consulted Charles. "Are you sure?" said Charles quietly. "I thought we were all having dinner together this evening." So he picks up the phone and he rings up to the nursery. And Wendy Berry notices his face looks really troubled and perplexed as he spoke to Diana. "Right," he said softly. "Well, will you please tell them that I'll be up to say goodnight in a moment then?" Charles ate his supper alone. William and his mother ate theirs in bed together with the television on. Diana's decision to have the meal in her room was a cruel blow for the prince and an increasingly common stunt she would pull to keep William and Harry away from their father. Well, William anyway, because Harry had already been dispatched to the nursery, so he was a non-starter as far as dinner trays with Diana in her room. But I would like to play devil's advocate, and I'm not making excuses for Diana, but I do think that she may have made that decision in this instance because she knew William was really troubled and a bit keyed up, and because they'd spent the day encouraging him and talking to him quietly about boarding school and trying to be encouraging, maybe she sensed that he'd had enough and that he would be better off just zoning out in front of the TV, eating a quick meal and then going up to bed. Maybe she thought that that was sort of the best course of action. Now, Wendy Berry's interpreting it as somehow trying to hit out at Charles. It was inconsiderate. I think Diana should have gone and consulted Charles and said, look, really, I think he'd be better off just having a quiet evening, snuggling with me, and then he can go to bed. And maybe he can have breakfast with you the next morning or something like that. So, I'm not sure that every action is necessarily a nefarious one. So I'll just throw that out there for consideration. But getting on, we can see that actually this does happen quite often. So I'm trying to be balanced, but we will go on, and from now on, you can make up your own mind. So that evening, Jessie, you remember the old Cockney nanny Jessie? Well, she was really fed up and she was having a chat in the dining room with Wendy Berry over a glass of wine. Now, at this stage, I'm sort of suspecting that Wendy Berry is seeking out disgruntled staff. I'm sort of feeling like she's almost interviewing them at this stage and then rushing back to her room and writing it down in her diary. a future reference. But she's having a glass of wine with Jessie, and Jessie is really quite peed off, we would say. And she says, Sandringham has been an absolute disaster. The princess spent most of the time crying, she said, shaking her head disapprovingly. And of course the boys were spoilt rotten by the court. I just don't know why she keeps on going up there with the boss. Now the boss, of course, is the Queen. If it's so miserable for her. Now, Wendy Berry says, of course, we all knew the problems. Diana hated holidaying with the Queen and the main Buckingham Palace household because she felt really uncomfortable in a large group of people, and I guess by this stage she was feeling their disapproval. I'm sure she was feeling their disapproval. And it's interesting that Wendy Berry points out, unlike Fergie, who was perfectly at ease in big social gatherings, and she was, and at that stage she was still quite popular with the royal family. I mean, she was this big, bouncy, exuberant puppy that just had managed to bounce in. And even though she sort of treated the staff appallingly, and she was rather arrogant, with the Queen and Prince Philip, she wasn't. She was this entertaining, big, happy-go-lucky puppy. And she hadn't done anything to earn their great disapproval yet. There'd been no so-tucking. So-tucking? So-tucking. Oh, I'm not going to edit that out. That's hilarious. Toe-sucking yet. And I guess Diana felt the contrast, because she had never been the sort of horsey, country, resilient type. She'd always been quite delicate and sensitive and, may I say, high maintenance. So the following morning, Diana took William out shopping and she bought him a Mr. Bean video. And when they came back, they actually spent the afternoon in the sitting room, Harry and William, watching this funny Mr. Bean video. And they felt quite relieved that Charles was off, because he always made them turn off the television and go outside. Which is like the parents we've all had all our lives, I guess. But, maybe, after school it's good to switch off and have a laugh and just watch a movie. I always loved watching movies with any chance I could. Now, Harry was usually in bed by 9 p.m. and William was allowed to stay up a little bit later. Now, on his last night at home, before he headed back to boarding school, he did actually have supper with Charles in the sitting room. Now, the interesting thing is Diana had her dinner on a tray in her room. And it's interesting, isn't it, that William was being forced to choose how he was going to spend his last night at home. So I guess that's why he had the night before with Diana in bed with her snuggling, watching TV, and then the last night he had dinner with Charles in the sitting room. And there's no suggestion that any one was better than the other. There's no suggestion that he didn't want to have dinner with his father. I mean, there's no suggestion of that. But it's hard on kids, isn't it? Because they probably would want to spend their last night at home with both their parents, as long as they weren't arguing. So the next morning, everyone was trying to cheer William up because he was a bit teary, and Diana and Charles both spoke quietly and affectionately to him, and he came into the kitchen to say goodbye to the staff, and he was a bit teary, and so both Wendy Berry and Paul Burrell embraced him and said that they were really looking forward to seeing him again for his first term break. And Charles said to Wendy Berry, I know exactly how he feels as the car pulled away. I went through exactly the same feelings myself before the start of every term. It doesn't make it any easier, of course, being who he is. Life can be made so very difficult. And later on, Diana rang about some household matter, and she said a really interesting thing that sort of stuck with Wendy Berry. She said, I don't think anyone really understands what it's like being caught up with the royal family. And Wendy Berry took note of the words caught up. I thought her choice of words strange. Caught up seemed to imply that their position in society was almost a curse rather than a privilege. And that's where I think no one understood Diana. I think that she did indeed think it was a curse, except at other times she really enjoyed it and thrived on the attention. So there's that little bit of mix match there. So they managed to avoid each other. Charles spent alternate nights at Highgrove House. Diana was firmly up in London, and they tended to only come down and meet up when Diana was bringing the boys down. Now, Diana, William and Harry arrived on Saturday, February the 1st, and dates are getting to be quite important now because, like I said, we're leading up to a crescendo. And she arrived in a brand new red Mercedes sports car. And Diana was ecstatic about the new car, and she showed it off proudly to everyone in the backyard. Now, the boys hopped in and got the detectives to raise and lower the roof repeatedly until Wendy Berry was actually scared that the thing would break. And then Diana asked if anybody wanted to spin, and a few brave staff hopped in the back seat, and Diana took them on this very, very fast ride. Dressed in jeans, jumper and a baseball cap, she put the car through its paces and took corners at over 60 miles per hour, loving the nervous laughter and genuine gasps of fear from the back seat. Now, I don't know. See, then again, I think that's a little bit juvenile, a little bit. I mean, it's good to plant the foot a little bit on a straight bit of road to give everyone a bit of a thrill and a giggle. But taking corners fast, things like that, I just think that that's inconsiderate of people's feelings, because how do they know whether she's a good driver or not? How do they know if she knows what she's doing? And, you know, staff mightn't want to die that day. They mightn't want her to miss a corner and skid into a tree. They might want to live. They might want to go back to their own families. And I know I'm overstating the mark. I know that. But, you know, I just think it's significant that when other people are relying on you, that maybe you don't plant the foot going round a corner. That's just me, maybe. That's what I drum into my boys anyway. Okay. So in her euphoria at getting the car of her dreams, Diana had not counted on Charles' reaction. He thought the Mercedes obscenely insensitive at a time of widespread recession. Of course, this is 1992, so yeah. Recession is a thing. It's a real thing. And very high unemployment. So he probably thinks it's a bit ostentatious. Mind you, he did have an Aston Martin, which is a sports car, but it was a British sports car. So his British sports car was allowed. But they had this huge fight. And Diana stormed out, and she was going to go for a walk. And when her detective, Peter Brown, asked where she was going, she replied, "For a bloody walk, Peter, so please don't follow me." Now, when Diana got back from her walk, she was in a bit of a better mood. However, she was in no mood to sit down to have dinner with Charles. And once again, she requested a bed tray. She asked Jessie to get Harry bathed and ready for bed, and she told Jessie that she would take care of William since he would be having supper again with her. Look, as mother of two boys, the fact that the last time William and Harry were down, that William had supper with his mother in her bedroom on a tray and had that special one-on-one attention, I would ensure that the next time that happened, it was Harry. I would make sure that the next time the little one got one-on-one me time, and I would explain to the big one that your turn was last time and this time it's the little one's turn. Or I would invite them both in, and if bedtime was a problem, I would make it earlier. I would have dinner earlier so the little one could join in. Wouldn't you? I mean, everyone out there is mum of probably more kids than me, and you know that you can't leave a child out like that. You just can't. You've got to give it equal attention as much as possible. Now, they all need different amounts of attention at different times, but you do try to even it up, don't you? Now, this is the kicker. The following morning, Diana asked for breakfast to be taken upstairs to the nursery. Now, look, Charles is relying on having the one-on-one time. If he can't have it at dinner, then he would have it at breakfast. before the boys had to go back to London. But she arranges for, yet again, a sort of meal to be exclusively for her. At least Harry was included this time. What a miracle that was. And William. And so Charles rushes up to the nursery and asks to speak to Diana downstairs in the sitting room. The princess refuses to come down. So Charles, presumably not wanting to make a fuss. Wendy Berry doesn't say that. I'm saying that. He goes back down to the sitting room and occupies himself with his copy of the Sunday Times. Now, later on, Wendy Berry is actually helping Jessie clean the nursery bathroom. And Jessie says this, and this is significant. She, meaning Diana, hasn't spoken to me since Christmas, you know, she grumbled, as she changed the sheets on Harry's bed. Now, look, it's around Saturday. Now, this would be Sunday, February the 2nd. And Jessie is saying that Diana hasn't spoken to her since Christmas at Sandringham. Now, how could the boys not pick up that level of tension if a mother is not speaking to the nanny? The boys would pick it up. And Harry's fobbed off with the nanny a lot. And William is invited into the inner sanctum a lot. So don't you think, I'm not making excuses for Harry, but how can the poor little boy not be damaged by this? How could he not pick up the tension between his mother and the nanny, especially when he's fobbed off on the nanny quite frequently? I just can't see how he wouldn't be damaged. I just can't see it. I can't see it. So that afternoon, after a rather gruesome lunch together, is how Wendy Berry describes it, where hardly a word was passed, Diana returned to London with the boys. And again, she was in floods of tears when she left, as Peter Brown took the wheel, William and Harry sitting subdued and confused in the back seat. The princess tried to wipe her eyes dry with a tissue as William put a comforting hand on his mother's shoulder. Oh my goodness me. It was very foggy outside, and as Peter turned on the car lights, I saw Diana put her face in her hands. Now she's in the bloody back seat with her boys, and she's putting her face just, in distress in her hands. Now, Prince Charles didn't come out and try and say goodbye. Look, I can't blame him, because by this stage, I don't think he would want to be associated with the distress. He doesn't want to associate himself with that level of distress in front of the boys. Now, I am not actually having a go at Diana about this, because you think about it. A mother displaying this level of sort of hysterical distress, and I'm not saying hysterical in a demeaning way, I'm saying that it is out of control. The distress is out of control. I'm not implying it's not real. I believe it's real, because I think that she is mentally unwell. Like, by this stage, I think it's obvious. I mean, if you can't control your emotions at all in front of your vulnerable children, well, then I would say that that is a point at which your mental distress is impacting on your children, impacting on your life, impacting on everybody in the household. And so therefore, I would say that that is, really damaged behaviour. So I don't feel blame. I feel pity. I feel pity on all of them, and I particularly feel pity for the boys. Now, Charles was taking Paddy out because Paddy was turning 79, and Charles took him out for a hot supper at badminton. Now, Paddy said to Wendy Berry that Charles was going to be in a bit of a state because he knew that he was already in a bit of a state. And on top of that, he had to do an official state visit to Oman, and he had to meet up with Diana in India. Yes, that trip to India, the famous one, where Diana was photographed sitting in front of the Taj Mahal all alone, looking very forlorn and alone. And, it was awful. It made headlines all over the world because it was quite a beautiful picture. And it really did illustrate how isolated Diana was at that point. So it just made worldwide headlines, and it made Charles look really bad yet again. And, the distress was starting to show show. It was definitely spilling over into headlines. Now, of course, that India trip was the one that Harry warned Meghan at when they weren't even engaged. They were just going out, and she was going off to India for one of her humanitarian efforts. And he warned her not to cosplay Diana, not to have a photograph taken of her in front of the Taj Mahal. So maybe he was quite aware at that stage that she had a tendency to try to cosplay his mother. Now, before Charles went off to Oman, even though Wendy Berry had the heads up, she was amazed at the level of distress Charles had, and his valet had gone ahead, to sort of prepare for his arrival. And so he was trying to get ready on his own, and he was, making phone calls down to the butler's pantry, and he couldn't find his shoehorn, and there was all sorts of trouble. Anyway, Charles appeared at the kitchen door, a rare sighting of him in staff quarters with Tigger in his arms. "Wendy," he said abruptly, "I think Tigger is ill. Make sure she gets the best treatment available. Ring up the vet, please, and make sure that he gives her a proper checkup." And he was really distressed. And Wendy Berry sort of assured him that she would look after Tigger, and his face breaking from an anguished sweat into a weak smile. "I would hate anything to happen to her." So he drove away, went off on his trip. Now, when Diana returned from India, Jessie brought Harry and William to Highgrove. William had an exit weekend, and Diana was anxious for both boys to be together. Once again, Diana asked for a bed tray for herself and William, and getting the nanny to put Harry to bed early in the nursery. I don't need to say anything, do I? Do I need to say anything? Look, I've got to say, reading this chapter, I feel like I've been too hard on Harry. Because I know people say, "Oh, he's grown up now, blah, blah, get over it, suck it up," all that sort of stuff. I get it. And no one has been harsher on Harry than me. But when I read this chapter, I see the little boy. I can't help seeing the little boy. And I can't help seeing how many times he was rejected. It smacks of the narcissist with their golden child. And you know how there's always a child left out, and then there's the golden child. Oh, this smacks of that to me. Now, Charles left for another skiing holiday, and Diana, around March the 6th, came down with Harry for a weekend, just the two of them, because William was at school. So great, Harry gets some one-on-one time, finally, with his mum. However, she arrives in a shocking mood. She arrives storming in through the back door, cursing loudly. And guess who she was cursing? The press. She'd been spotted by a photographer on a bridge on the M4 in her new Mercedes and was preparing herself for a public storm of protest about the car. "Effing press," she repeated several times. "Why can't the bosses just leave me alone?" And who was observing this tirade? Harry. Harry, who arrived with her. Now, it wasn't just poor Harry that was getting severely screwed up at this stage. It was also Evelyn, her dresser. Now, Evelyn was distressed on pretty much every weekend that she came down with Diana. And she had actually sat on her bed, crying, sobbing loudly. And Wendy Berry had, Evelyn, darling, do you want to have someone to talk to?" And then she goes back, writes it all out, ready for her book. But anyway, I'm being far too cynical, aren't I? However, this is what Evelyn said. Now, she's sobbing, and she's saying this to Wendy Berry. "I don't think I can carry on much longer," she said wretchedly. "My life has been made a misery, and I just don't know what to do." I took her in my arms and let her pour her heart out to me. In fits and starts, she sobbed, "She just won't speak to me anymore. I've given her so much of my life. I've worked for her right at the beginning." Now, Diana did have other dresses, but Evelyn was the constant, right? The constantly abused one. "And I've sacrificed so much for what? Just to be thrown out as a piece of rubbish when she feels like it. Nobody knows what she's really like. She can be so cruel. Now, again, that is just the opinion of a staff member that is getting a really hard time by their boss. And we know that in any workplace, often a boss can be really mean to one staff member. I'm not making excuses because it's happened to me in real life, and I'm sure it's happened to a lot of you. And it's very distressing, and it affects your family, and it affects your life, and it's horrendous, and there is no excuse for it. However, in my experience, I have found that people that behave like that, so unreasonably, so meanly, so cruelly, are mentally unhinged. They've got a mental vulnerability and they need help. There's something going on. There's definitely something serious going on. Anyway, while she's sobbing to Wendy Berry, the phone rings in Evelyn's room. "Yes, it's me, Evelyn," the receiver squawked, so evidently Wendy Berry could hear. "Go into town and get me one." Now, the one is a brush. She had screamed at Evelyn. There was sounds of high-pitched shouting coming from Diana's room earlier that day because a particular styling brush hadn't been packed. And Evelyn said, well, first Diana said, "The styling brush, yes, the styling brush, you idiot," she yelled. Charming. "But you haven't used it for 6 months," Evelyn countered. "Get out," stormed Diana, slamming the door. So now she's ringing Evelyn, the sobbing Evelyn, and telling her, I shouldn't laugh, telling her to go and get one. "I don't care where you have to go, as long as you come back with what I want." The phone was slammed down, and Wendy Berry walked poor sobbing Evelyn to the car, and she was gone for well over 2 hours. So evidently the shops near Highgrove, it was quite hard to find a styling brush, and she came back with the said styling brush, and by the time she got back to Highgrove, Diana had decided she didn't want to use it anymore. All right, so the next chapter, the next video is Public Revelations, Chapter 17. And this is very juicy and very interesting because it covers the publication of Andrew Morton's book, Diana, the Real Story, and all the subsequent fallout for that from a staff's perspective, and also King Charles's, the then Prince Charles, reaction. And it wasn't pretty. I'll be back with that very soon. Thanks for joining me. See you again. Bye.